All right, excellent. Well, hello and good morning. And it's wonderful you can join us today for our briefing on the activities of the International Sustainability Standard Board's activities. I'm here from Katie Schmitz-Hewlett, who's our special guest today. My name is Matt Honey, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to EY on behalf of the Group 100. I'd also like to welcome those of you who are joining us online, and thanks for joining us. I'd like to start this morning by acknowledging the traditional owners and the custodians of the spectacular country on which we meet today, the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and pass my respect to their elders, both past and present, and to emerging community leaders. I also acknowledge the important role of Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people within EY, the Group of 100, and the communities that we work with. As well as being a partner at EY, it's my privilege to serve as a board member with the Group of 100, Australia's peak body for CFOs. EY and the Group of 100 have a long-standing relationship, hosting joint events, and through the Group of 100 EY CFO First 100 Days program, a bespoke program for new CFOs. The Group of 100 has been extremely active, and we've returned to in-person events this year, supplementing the many webinars that are available to our members. We have great relationships with incoming government, and later this year we'll be holding our political engagement day in Canberra with the nation's leaders, and a big day today with the climate bill being introduced to the Parliament in Canberra. Just a little bit on EY, we're proud to have reached carbon neutrality last year. In fact, we offset 130% of our carbon footprint globally, and we're on track to reach net zero by 2025. We're also a proud supporter of the Group 100 Sustainability Working Group through Terence, who chairs that working group. And Terence, great for you to put this on today. Many of you who are joining us are members of that group, and it's really helping CFOs create better and more sustainable businesses for tomorrow, which is the purpose of the Group 100. Understanding corporate sustainability reporting is a key plank of this, and we're delighted to have Katie and Michael join us today. So Michael Bray is going to start proceedings for us this morning. Michael's a Fellow of Integrated Reporting at Deakin University and Special Advisor to the CEO and Senior Market Leader for Australia, New Zealand and Sri Lanka for the Value Reporting Foundation. Michael, thanks very much.
Thanks for having us. As some of you know, I've been on this journey for about 25 years, some more than others. And the last 2 years have just been unbelievable. When the IRC was formed in 2010 and the framework was issued in 2013, we said the end game is when we don't exist. It's when the IFRS Foundation owns the Integrated Reporting Framework. So I'm pleased to announce that next Monday it will. And so it's all happening. But the last 2 years have been just such change in corporate reporting, more than I've ever seen. And arguably, this goes back 80 years or arguably even a few hundred years. And the world in which the Value Reporting Foundation has lived in its short existence of 1 year, this is all part of it. The IRC existed for that. The VRF, Katie and I in that organisation, only 12 months, but that's success. That's what we all wanted. So it's a bit of a momentous week here this week. We have Sue Lloyd, who is the Vice Chair of the IAASB, and we have Katie down from the US to talk about very specifically the IAASB and its standards. Just think about it. COP26 last year announced that all this was going to happen. April, IAASB formed, exposure drafts out. And so I'm sure, Katie, you're going to ask everyone to make sure they've got their submissions in by this Friday, please, because it's really important stuff. So we've got the IFRS Foundation consolidation of the VRF happening next Monday. We've got the IAASB exposure drafts comments due. We've got the framework going into the IFRS Foundation next Monday. And so what an opportunity to let Katie talk to all of you about what is happening with the IAASB exposure drafts and standards, and answer any questions you might have. So Katie, with that, I'll hand over to you.
Thanks, Michael, and thanks EY for hosting this event, and all of you for braving the weather and COVID. again, resurging, to join us this morning. So Michael, that was a perfect introduction because I can't think of, I mean, if you had asked me 3 years ago, if I'd be here talking about the merger of the Value Reporting Foundation with IFRS, I would have laughed. It was the ultimate end game, but it happened much more rapidly than I think anybody was expecting. And I think we can attribute just what's happening in the real world, in the real economy, and particularly in the case of the SASB standards being integrated into the ISSB and the IIRC integrated reporting framework being folded up in there as well, to market demand, and particularly investor demand. So I'll talk about what's happening. Michael laid all of this out, but we now have, what you all are likely familiar with, the IFRS, IASB financial accounting standards, which are used in over 140 jurisdictions around the world, now has a sister board, the ISSB, the International Sustainability Standards Board, which has been set out to establish standards for sustainability-related financial information disclosure, particularly to the investor audience. It, as I mentioned, has been formed in response to market demand from investors and businesses to simplify the global landscape of corporate reporting. You'll hear us talk a lot about establishing a foundational global baseline for disclosure. And why do we need that? Because global investors have global portfolios, and at the moment, it's very challenging for them to compare companies apples to apples, their performance on sustainability-related risks and opportunities across jurisdictions. So the establishment of a global baseline for disclosure will give investors the ability to compare companies across markets. Again, the audience for this information is the investor audience. And it, I think, will also enable companies to get very focused about the intersection between sustainability risks and opportunities and business models, and where you ought to be thinking about maybe shifting around capital allocations. And you'll hear us talk a lot about a building block approach to facilitate the development of a comprehensive global reporting system that uses this foundational global baseline as a starting place, but not an endpoint to reporting. Why is that important? Because we have jurisdictions around the world with varying levels of ambition when it comes to what they are aiming to do. So we see in the European Union very ambitious and aggressive mandates for reporting, not only on those issues that are related to enterprise value, which is the focus of the ISSB, but in the European Union, there are requirements to also report on impact. What are a company's impacts on society, the environment? With the establishment of a global baseline and a building block approach to a corporate reporting system that works across jurisdictions, you can have that ambition in the European Union or other markets. But if you use this foundational global baseline focused on enterprise value as a starting place, again, it gives investors that comparability that they are seeking across their portfolios. We're also aiming to establish connectivity between sustainability disclosure and financial statements. So you see that the lines between the IASB and the ISSB on this slide converge, and that's very intentional. The Integrated Reporting Council will advise the IASB and ISSB on connectivity via fundamental concepts and guiding principles in the Integrated Reporting Framework to establish that connectivity, again, to provide investors and other providers of capital information that they need about how these two streams of information actually intersect with one another or are related to one another. Again, this is all in response to market demand. I'm not going to read all of these quotes to you, but over the years, investors, investor trade associations around the world, and major investors, including BlackRock and Norges Bank Investment Management, have been calling for SASB and TCFD related disclosure, again, because they have been looking for comparable, consistent, and reliable data, which has been lacking in voluntary disclosure frameworks over time. And it's had tremendous results. So 3,400 organizations expressed support for TCFD, over 2,000 businesses around the world are using SASB standards in their reporting to their investors, and 2,500 businesses use the IR framework to drive integrated reporting. I think this is a great snapshot that is courtesy of Goldman Sachs Global Investment Research that shows the uptake of TCFD and SASB compared with GRI. So if you look at the left of this graph, in 2015, there were hardly any SASB reporters because we didn't codify our standards until 2018. They were still in development, provisional standard form at that point. And over the years, you can see after codification, just this massive uptick in reporting, both in TCFD and SASB, so that we are now on par with GRI reporting, the Global Reporting Initiative around the world. And this, I think, also demonstrates intuitively to me, maybe not to others, the complementarity between these reporting frameworks. So we're not saying that SASB and TCFD will overtake or do away with GRI. They're very, very complementary, and other stakeholders around the world are looking for the information that's in GRI reporting, but the investor audience is looking for a very specific subset of disclosure, and that is what SASB and TCFD and now the ISSB disclosure standards are aiming to provide investors. It may not seem like this, but I assure you that this represents a tremendous simplification in the disclosure landscape. And this again is in response to market demand. We've been hearing from the very beginning of SASB and likely the IIRC calls for rationalization, harmonization, simplification of the disclosure landscape. And that's what we are seeing with these mergers. So last year, the IIRC and SASB merged to form the Value Reporting Foundation. Now the Value Reporting Foundation is being folded into IFRS, but it's also significant to note that, as we talk about the disclosure drafts, that the TCFD recommendations are also really the founding architecture of the ISSB exposure drafts. So that framework is now being enshrined, if you will, in the ISSB exposure drafts. So you see TCFD recommendations and SASB standards, both embedded in the ISSB climate disclosure standard, or IFRS S2, technically speaking, that's what that standard is. SASB standards are going through an ISSB due process as the industry-based requirements for the general reporting requirements in IFRS S1. And then the integrated reporting framework, as I mentioned, will inform both IASB and ISSB due process, creating a framework for connectivity between financial and sustainability disclosure. So simplification is coming. It will happen in a stepwise fashion as these standards go through a due process. So getting back to the idea of a building blocks approach, this graphic emerged in its original format in about September of 2020, when a group that at the time was affectionately called the Group of Five, which included SASB, GRI, IARC, CDP, and the Climate Disclosure Standards Board, got together and said, the market is asking for simplification and rationalization of the reporting landscape, but we can't have a single standard that meets the needs of all stakeholders and all audiences. But what we can do is to sit around a table and begin to simplify the landscape and show how the puzzle pieces actually fit together. So if you look at the innermost box, and we have financial reporting with an investor focus that we, again, over 140 jurisdictions around the world are using the IASB, the IFRS financial accounting standards. GAAP in other countries, in the US, for example, promulgated by FASB. Nobody questions whether or not they should follow those standards for their financial reporting. It happens on a regular basis, and hasn't always been that case. When those first were promulgated, there was a lot of jockeying back and forth about how, what should the standards be. But today, that's sort of this bedrock of financial reporting. What ISSB is doing through the incorporation of SASB standards, the IIRC framework, references to the CDSB framework, is putting together standards for sustainability-related financial disclosures that are, and quite literally adjacent to what's in financial reporting, because we have evidence that we have developed over the formation of SASB standards over time through significant market feedback, thousands of hours of thousands of individuals around the world, not only from the investor community, but also the corporate world, as well as members of the accounting profession and other public interest groups, conferring around what are the sustainability related issues that have an impact on the world, but also can come back and affect the financial condition, operating performance, or market valuation of a company in a given industry. And that's what you'll find in the ISSB IFRS sustainability disclosure standards. That is a subset of this larger outer box of sustainability reporting that's aimed at a broader multi-stakeholder audience on a variety of sustainability matters that represent impacts on society, the environment, others, in the real economy. GRI has been the standard that has been used predominantly for companies in the world to report on those impacts. And you'll see that there are dotted lines that separate all of the chambers, if you will, of this graph to show that this is a system that is dynamic, and there are things in the world of in the real economy that today we don't necessarily have evidence of the impact on the financial condition or enterprise value or the assessment of enterprise value of companies in a given industry. But those things can change very rapidly. COVID is a great example of that. Things that weren't even on the radar a few years ago that have affected literally every company around the world. So this again goes back to the building block approach to show that if we can establish this global baseline of sustainability related financial disclosure in this red box, and jurisdictions like the European Union that also want reporting on impact can tack on that impact related reporting, then you can start to see this harmonization and the rationalization of the reporting landscape. ISSB has committed to building on SASB standards and the industry-based approach that SASB has taken. And one of the reasons for that is that investors are really asking for it. And the other reason is, as CFOs, you likely know, that not all sustainability related issues are relevant to your business or your business models. And so an industry-based approach to standards can really help focus in on those areas that are most pertinent to your business, which is among the reasons that ISSB is building on SASB standards. So the value for companies and investors of this rationalization, in our view, is continuity with existing standards and frameworks. In the graph that I shared with you from Goldman Sachs, we see that there are thousands of companies around the world that are already using SASB and TCFD. So this doesn't represent a pivot or a dramatic shift away from companies that are using those standards and frameworks. It is in response to investor demand, which will continue, and in jurisdictions like the US, where the SEC's proposed climate rule may never be implemented if it is litigated, and there's a lot of talk about that. Investor demand for this kind of information and disclosure will continue. It's in response to demands for simplification of the ESG landscape and harmonization of disclosure across jurisdictions. And it may seem like I'm flogging a dead horse here, but investors really want an industry-based view of this information because that's how they organize themselves. Analysts cover different sectors. They don't necessarily cover specific topics. So it's very helpful to have an industry view of these issues. So taking a closer look at the exposure drafts, I mentioned IFRS S1, which are the general reporting requirements, and IFRS S2, which are climate disclosure draft. The general requirements require companies to provide material information on all significant sustainability-related risks and opportunities that are necessary to assess enterprise value. SASB standards are noted as priority materials in those requirements to enable companies to, again, hone in on those issues that are likely to be significant for the assessment of enterprise value. Priority materials are, you can think of those as implementation guidance. So they aren't integrated into the actual standard. Among the reasons for that is that the SASB standards need to go through an ISSB due process in order to be included in ISSB requirements. As I mentioned, but probably didn't emphasize this strongly enough, TCFD, the TCFD framework is not only incorporated into the climate exposure drafts, but also the general requirements. And I think this is a tremendous advancement in that it provides a very elegant and I think easy to understand architecture for reporting using the TCFD framework, asking companies to think about what and to report what is your governance, what is your strategy, risk management, targets and metrics for managing significant sustainability related risks and opportunities. The key features of the general requirements, and I'll provide you with links to these documents if you haven't seen them later, the emphasis on the need for consistency and connections between financial statements and sustainability reporting requirements, requiring that financial statements and sustainability disclosure be published at the same time, which is something that investors are really very interested in seeing, and facilitating the application across different jurisdictions. Again, but thinking about that building block approach that we've been talking about for establishing a comprehensive system for corporate reporting. So there's no designation for the specific location of where this information should be reported to provide that flexibility for companies depending on where they are and which jurisdiction in which they operate. The climate disclosure draft incorporates TCFD recommendations and industry-based requirements from SASB standards. So in this case, SASB's 68 industry-based standards that are relevant to climate are actually embedded in this standard. The standard requires disclosure of material information about significant climate-related risks and opportunities, building again almost word for word on the TCFD recommendations. And I'll talk a little bit about the improvements to the SASB standards that are included in the exposure draft on climate in a moment, actually right now. So among the things that we heard almost the moment that SASB standards were codified was a call from the market to say, why are financed and facilitated emissions not part of the industry standards for the financial sector? And one of the reasons for that was that there was not an agreed upon methodology for calculating financed or facilitated emissions. One of the advancements that you'll see in the SASB standards that are included in the appendix of the climate disclosure draft is a call for disclosing facilitated and financed emissions, and that's based on methodology that emerged between probably 2018 and last year. Among those methodologies is something that PCAF has developed, so you'll see those in the standards. And you'll also see proposed changes to metrics that in the original SASB standards were challenging for companies outside the US to use. So among the things that we have heard over the years is, well, SASB grew up and was formed in the US, and it's challenging for us to use these things outside the US. We've made tremendous advancements over time to work on internationalizing those metrics. Further internationalization of those metrics is underway, but a major step has been taken to internationalize metrics that are included in the climate disclosure standards, and Appendix B is where you'll find them. And again, it's often what I'm hearing from the market is sort of confusion about, well, there are 68 industry standards that are appended to the climate disclosure standard, but I only operate in one. Well, those are the ones that you would use. The whole point of industry-based standards is to help you focus and not be reporting on things that are not relevant to your business. But there is a little bit of confusion in the market about that. Key features of the climate disclosure exposure draft are looking at emissions targets and the use of carbon offsets in terms of transition planning, looking at the resilience of business strategies in multiple scenarios, climate resilience, and the requirement to disclose greenhouse gas emissions scope 1, 2, and 3. So there are a variety of helpful materials that are available for anyone who's interested in learning more about these. There is a snapshot, a short overview of both exposure drafts. There is a comparison between the climate exposure draft and TCFD recommendations. There is a comparison between exposure drafts that are currently open for comment, as well as prototypes that were published in November of 2021 at COP26, when it was announced that the ISSB was forthcoming. There were prototype standards that were published, and you'll see that even since then, there have been advancements in both of those standards and prototypes that were published. And then there's illustrative guidance for the general requirements and the climate disclosure requirements, including illustrative metrics. And I'm happy to share the links that are linked in this slide with anybody who's interested in receiving them. So what's been going on since all of this has been happening? We've been receiving tremendous support across markets. G7 finance ministers and central bank governors issued a communique in support. The SASB Standards Investor Advisory Group, which is comprised of over 60 investors with 53 trillion in assets under management across markets, have expressed their support of the direction of travel of the exposure drafts. IASB and ISSB have articulated their plans for further integrating the integrated reporting framework into their work moving forward. ISSB has communicated plans to build on SASB's industry-based standards. We've had a number of webinars on the exposure drafts, and all of those are available on the IFRS website for anyone who's interested in learning more about them. There's a lot of information on this. In the interest of time, I won't go through all of this, but the ISSB has been established. Consolidation with the Climate Disclosure Standards Board has already taken place. The Value Reporting Foundation consolidates with IFRS next week, and we've published our exposure drafts. In addition to the ISSB members who are shown here, there have been 2 more appointments to the ISSB. We have 4 to go after this. So we're establishing a very strong board who will be working on moving the standards as we go forward, and taking the feedback that we will be receiving during this comment period. So where are we? We talk about this being kind of a unique moment in time where there are a variety of consultations that are open or have been open that are all looking at similar or related issues. So as I mentioned, the SEC proposed a climate rule that was open for comment until mid-June. That comment period is now closed. The ISSB exposure drafts are open for comment until the 29th. And then FREG exposure drafts on European sustainability reporting standards are open through August 8th. And I'm hearing from the market sort of like, all right, what do I focus on when? Many people are taking kind of we'll do this one first, this one second, and the other third, which makes sense in terms of the arrow of time. But I think it's also helpful to note how these things are interrelated with one another. They, in my view, shouldn't be seen as separate. This is an opportunity where we have a window for people to talk about the importance of establishing a global baseline. So just as voluntary standards are beginning to consolidate and harmonize, there's the risk of regulatory fragmentation. And we absolutely, I think, can agree that would not benefit anyone. So for people who are able to provide comment, I think expressing support for the establishment of a global baseline is a very important comment to make, even if you can't answer every question in the ISSB exposure drafts, because there are many of them. So if you send only a 1-paragraph comment letter, it would be great to note that. So in summary, please encourage your networks to provide comment if it's possible to the general reporting requirements and climate exposure drafts by the 29th. Help us establish a comprehensive global baseline for corporate reporting. Work with us as we move forward to improve the standards and to further internationalize them. Express support for the simplification of and harmonization of the disclosure landscape. And then be on the lookout later this year as ISSB also will publish an agenda consultation on what will come next. What should we focus on next from here? We are very, very interested in market feedback and want to hear from you. Here are a couple of things that you can hone in on. Again, the questions in the exposure drafts are quite voluminous, but if any of these things are things that you feel strongly about, you can hone in on fair presentation, which is question 7, costs and benefits and likely effects in question 16, the importance of a global baseline in question 14, industry-based standards and the importance of being able to focus on those things that are most relevant to your business models and operating models, also important. And again, expressing support for a global baseline approach would be incredibly helpful. And then when it comes to the climate-related consultation, questions 11A through 11L are focused on industry-based requirements, internationalization of the standards, question 11A, finance to facilitated emissions, again, because that's a new topic for us and a new methodology, is something that we're very interested in getting feedback on. And then identification of climate-related risks and opportunities in question 3B would also be incredibly helpful. You can provide comments via a survey on the IFRS website or via a comment letter. As I mentioned, you don't need to answer every question in the consultations. All of this information is available on the IFRS website. And we are very, very interested in market feedback. So please let us know what your thoughts are. And with that, I'll stop here and hopefully you'll have some questions about all of this.
Okay, are you going to make the slides available?
Absolutely, yeah. Yeah, I need to provide you an update from the PDF that you got. Okay, from Peter.
Great. Thank you, Katie. So for those that haven't met me, I'm Sharon's G100. I'm a partner at EY based in Melbourne. I also chair the G100 Sustainability Working Group, but also have an advisory role with the Value Reporting Foundation, working with Michael, Katie and Neil and so on. And we have had the VRF and part of that SASB present to G100 over the last 2 years. We might have had you about 3 times, I think, over the last 2 years. Lots has been happening. So I've got some pre-prepared questions, but I think given the size of the audience, it'd be good to get you engaged and not have you fall asleep. So I might throw to the audience first, and if there aren't questions, I'll pose my questions, Katie. So I've got the chat box open, so please feel free to put that in the chat. But given, again, the size of the audience online, you could unmute or put your hand up, and then I'll call out. Any in the room? Jacinta.
I've got so many. Hello.
Hi.
I think it's fabulous, and look, definitely, we definitely express our support for the global baseline. I think that's fabulous. I've probably got a couple of questions around the approach to developing the boundary for material issues and how this process will define the appropriate suite of material topics on an industry basis. I think that sounds fabulous. But I feel like there's usually a bit of a chicken and egg approach where companies will go through the materiality assessment, and what we come up with is very similar to what SASB might define for our industry. It's not always the same. It's a little bit of a chicken and egg approach where we will advocate for certain topics and ultimately you'll see them come into standard. But if we sort of drop away from that, what's traditionally a GRI process, as we move towards this process, I guess I'm just a little concerned that some of those material issues that we normally bubble up might get lost if we don't continue to push through that process. So I had a question around that about the process of determining materiality, and then also had just some logistical questions about how we want to prepare those reports in line with financial statements as well.
Okay.
We're going to materiality first.
Yeah, so it's always up to the entity to determine what's material, and the SASB standards are meant to provide a starting place for, based on market feedback when the standards were developed. Those are the issues, those are the disclosure topics and the related metrics that people coalesced around for those that are most likely to be relevant and material for companies in a given industry. So you're always welcome to report beyond that. If you've gone through materiality assessment and have determined that there are other things that are relevant to the assessment of enterprise value that you want your investor audience to know, don't stop at the what's in the industry standard for SASB. The SASB standards will continue on, so it's not wrong for me to say that, but over time I'll have to evolve them into the ISSB terminology. But that it's always up to the enterprise to determine what's material, and the last thing we want is for companies to be going through a tick box exercise to say, here's all the things that you've asked for, but without doing the process, the integrated thinking of how am I generating value and how can I express to my investors that in a way that is clear to them in a language that they understand. So hopefully that answers that question.
Katie, I reckon this one is a really good example of the connectivity between the integrated reporting framework and the IAASB standards. Because if you look in the framework, there's a requirement to disclose about materiality determination process,
Yes.
also about stakeholder management process.
Yes.
So with Katie's nested materiality diagram up there, the 3 boxes, sure, when you look at the operating environment, you're going to be scanning all of the 3 boxes, and the board of directors and the management will go through the process of thinking about what the stakeholders said as well as what they want to do. They'll work out through a filtering process what's material, and they'll disclose in their integrated report that they've done all this, and here's the IAASB metrics. But we didn't forget about what's in the outer box. We actually thought about it.
Yeah.
And here's some of the areas that we thought about.
Yes.
I think that's just a classic on connectivity.
Yeah, and also I think it's also if you go back to the beginning, before there were SASB standards, when we were looking at how to go about establishing the SASB standards, we scanned the landscape of what companies were reporting, what companies investors were asking about. And so there will always be an interplay between that outer box and the what's in the standards, so that we need to maintain the standards over time. They need to be made evergreen or kept evergreen, if you will. So there will be emerging issues that companies may begin reporting on that we then set a standard around over time. So they're not fixed in stone.
Yes.
Okay.
Lovely. Thank you. No, that makes sense. Can I ask one quick question as well? Yeah. Okay. The logistics of preparing these fine documents. So we're looking to have the climate information and the sustainability disclosures coming out sometimes financial statements. Is there a general envisaging this is coming out in one document, or are you still expecting to see multiple documents, or don't care?
I think the expectation is that in the beginning, there will likely be multiple documents with, I think, the ambition of over time, these things going into a single report. But again, if I can't recall which slide it was on, but there's no designation about where this needs to be disclosed. Again, it's up to every enterprise to determine where the information lands. In some jurisdictions, there's a requirement for it to go in a special place, and in others there's not. So we've left that open.
What about the climate and the sustainability disclosures? You're expecting that they will come out in the one disclosure? Because there's the 2 prototypes, but is it the same source of information?
Honestly, I don't have a good answer for that. I think we'll see it evolve over time. I think some companies may put it all together. Others may, what we see in voluntary adoption of SASB and TCFD right now is sometimes they're in a single report, sometimes they're in separate reports, sometimes they're different tabs on a website. So I think it's still early days to talk about.
Katie, I reckon I could give you an Australian take on this one.
Yeah.
And it comes back to recommendation 4.3 of the ASX Corporate Governance Principles and Recommendations.
Yeah.
It's about directors saying that they're happy with the process for the integrity of all corporate reports other than audited financial statements. And if you look in the commentary, it says OFRs in directors' reports, integrated reports, sustainability reports. I think the location in Australia is probably the operating and financial review in the director's report, informed by using the integrated reporting framework. So the OFR becomes an integrated report. And 4.3 is the thing that gives this some fair authority. I think that's an Australian take on it.
Thanks, Mark.
Thanks for that.
So I just wanted just one last thing about the logistics of preparing this information. I like the idea of getting all the information out at one time. We find the sustainability information usually isn't prepared and audited until about the time that the financial results are released, or even a little bit afterwards. So how do we rationalise that? Are you happy to work with 3/4 or 11 months data and recurring those statements ongoing, or is it better to wait and get the data right?
We're getting a lot of feedback on that synchronicity, the timing of reporting, not only here, but in other markets. So how we go about resolving that is sort of an open question, and I would encourage you to express those challenges and to say, we generally are supportive, but these are the challenges that we're facing.
We can find a way to get you the information, but it might not be the great information that you want.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So I think that is among the things that I'm hearing consistently in the feedback that we're getting is the challenge, because this is, all of a sudden these things are maturing. These systems we're reporting that have been kind of informal or casual, now talking about putting these things into the reports that Michael was talking about. This is all getting very real, and systems of internal control need to be in place to assure that the data. And so I think that there will be provisions made for accommodating those challenges in a stepwise manner, but I don't know exactly what they'll be.
And as Australians think again, Terence, what are you saying to your clients about this one?
So we've got some clients who, over time, lined up the reporting together. So those clients are going to be well placed, but the vast majority are still lagging behind. So I think they'll have to give the feedback, Katie, and have a phased approach to this. I think so. I might pose a sort of a related question. It's a good segue to my question, which is sort of to the CFOs in the room and who dialed in and in Australia. What's the sort of message in terms of preparing for future IFRS standards? What do finance teams and CFOs need to do? And also, if you can sort of combine that with the question around SEC and EU reporting requirements. If you're sitting in Australia as a CFO, what's potentially likely from SEC and EU that's going to impact you? But also what's the overlap between those and the ISSB requirements? If you tick ISSB, can you tick off SEC?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I'll take the last part of your question first. There's tremendous overlap between the ISSB climate standard and the SEC's proposed climate rule. And I don't think that's coincidental because the SEC sits on IASCO Committee 1, which oversees the IFRS as a governing body. And so they knew what was coming. So as I mentioned, if the climate rule is never implemented in the US, it may be, but investors, I believe, will ask for ISSB climate related disclosure. So I think for a CFO, if you're preparing for that, I think you'll be well positioned to comply with. And there was actually a question in the SEC's climate rule asking whether or not foreign private issuers could use should the SEC allow foreign private issuers to use ISSB disclosure to comply with the climate rule. So we're still in the process of analyzing what the responses are, but I think most people were very favorable to that. In the broader landscape, I sort of view the disclosure landscape as, the SEC, the US on one end as a good anchor because it doesn't move a lot.
Yeah.
And then you've got the expanding frontier of disclosure led by the European Union, which is, pushing and pushing and pushing, as well they should, looking to see what a company's impacts on the real world are. There's a bit of a timing dysfunction, if you will, related to all of that, because when FRAG, which is the standard setting body for the European Union, began that process of setting standards for the European Union, ISSB didn't exist. And so what we're hoping for now is that we can sort of pause a little bit and we can get some time to coalesce around using the ISSB standards for that foundational global baseline, that half of double materiality that the European Union is asking for, that focus on enterprise value. If we can establish ISSB as the standards that are used by the European Union for that part of disclosure with the impact-oriented disclosure on top of it, that's a win-win. And that's our vision for a comprehensive system for global reporting. That's what we mean when we say that, when we talk about a building blocks approach. What we're really hoping for is that we can, call timeout, get a little bit of time and get market feedback to both FREG and ISSB, say, hey, we all want a harmonized system. We don't want regulatory fragmentation. So if I were a CFO sitting here or in other markets, I would want to be looking at what are in the exposure drafts for the ISSB standards that are open for comment now. What are the industry standards for the industry or industries in which I operate that SASB has promulgated, and just familiarizing yourselves with those. And then doing your materiality assessment to say, what am I missing, if anything, or what's missing from those, and how would I go about putting together a communication to my investors that really demonstrates how I am navigating these risks and opportunities.
And so that poses a question, Katie, which is coming up with clients around capability. I sort of see finance teams taking over this information that's traditionally sat within sustainability teams. So do we see a future in 2 to 3 years' time where finance teams are managing and aligning timeframes for this data alongside the financial information?
I think that's definitely the direction of travel. I think it makes good sense. I still think that sustainability practitioners are going to be the ones who are kind of out there, on the frontier, because there are going to be emerging issues that we haven't even thought of. A great example of that is the TNFD, the Task Force on Nature-Related Financial Disclosure, which is looking at ecosystem collapses, loss of biodiversity, and the impacts that has on business, which seems sort of perverse and reverse. But ecosystems are collapsing, and the report that was issued just last week here in Australia demonstrates that. I think something about, was it 16 ecosystems are on the verge of collapse here? Astonishing, right? If we don't have pollinators, we don't have agricultural food product. It's all interrelated. So what are the next issues? How are we thinking about those things? So sustainability practitioners are going to need to be, I think, synced up with their finance teams. I don't think that the finance will only be working on this. I think it's going to require partnership across disciplines.
Any other questions from the audience? So, Michael, I might draw you into this question as well, while others are thinking about questions, which is around the integrated reporting framework. So that's sort of been brought into the ISSB group. But how do we sort of see that influence corporate reporting over the long term, once these sort of technical standards are out?
Well, I reckon when you get back to your desk next week, Katie, there might be a couple of submissions from Australia, possibly from directors, possibly. I see Stephen Woodhill's on the call, maybe from this group. Director concerns around, this is just going to add to the volume and complexity. This is going to increase our liability exposure. I think there's natural answers to both of them, but I think there's a little bit of a timing difference here, that all the attention so far has been on the exposure drafts and getting submissions in, and the framework doesn't go into the IFRS Foundation until next week. And if John Stanhope was sitting there, he'd be saying, we've already got the answer. It's okay.
Yeah.
One integrated report containing both ISSB and GRI metrics, pretty much the same in most cases anyway. One report with all the metrics reduces volume and complexity. It's clearer for investors. It reduces liability exposure. The answer lies here and now. No change in legislation, regulation, or anything else, just do it.
Yeah, and I think, adding on to that, I think I mentioned this in earlier remarks, or if I didn't, should have. This should be not an exercise about how do I, fill in the blanks, right? The whole point here is that we're facing risks and opportunities that simply haven't been well understood when looking at a company only through its financial reports, right? Its financial statements. They're very complex issues, and it requires integrated thinking about how are we actually managing these things that may or may not have been on the radar. So I think if you follow that approach to say, right, we're going to take a step back and see this as an invitation to really, ensure that we are looking at the bigger picture of what's on the horizon. Are we well positioned? What's our risk management around these things? So on and so forth. I think companies will, in the long run, benefit from this. Will it require investments in both time, resources, money? Yes. But I think the risks of not being attuned to these, the cost of not being attuned to those risks and opportunities probably outweighs the investment in some cases of getting your head around it and getting your house in order.
I mentioned Australian Post. You might have heard Mr. Stanhope saying that thing a few times.
Yeah.
I think we're about 5 minutes out, and I know these days people need to jump on to other calls. So I might call the meeting to an end. I know I can see Jacinta still got questions, so she might call Katie for some questions afterwards. What we are going to be doing with this is we've got it recorded. So if anyone from your team, so others have missed out, there will be a recording. I'd like to take the opportunity to thank Katie for making time to come out here, missing your summer and arriving here in winter and joining us all the way out in Australia. So thank you for making the time to come and see us. And we're very much looking forward to contributing to the drafts and the other work that you're going to be doing in the coming future. Obviously, as I can sort of say, the issues of ESG are very much core to business, and nothing says it like what we experienced in the UK last week and through Europe and through the US with bushfires. I was in London last week when the record was broken, and according to UK Met Office modelling, that was meant to happen in 2050. That's happening now. And so this is very much core business. Rail services were down, tarmacs were rising, all sorts of business interruptions were going on. So very much looking forward to, I guess, accelerating the work that you're doing so that this can be core to business in the near future. So thank you, and thanks for the audience and everyone in the room for getting up early and joining us.
Yeah, thanks everyone. Thanks again for the opportunity. I will happily miss summer in the US anytime we come to Australia in winter. So
Thanks, Katie.
Yeah.
Thanks, everyone.
thanks.
Thank you.